All right. Hi, everybody. Um, Thought you might enjoy a little variety in the background today. Today I'm going to talk to you about um, Catholicism and anti-Catholicism in the United States. So we're moving away from, we talked about the Great Awakenings last week. Those were all Protestant movements. Those were Protestants who were experiencing those revivals. They were not Catholics, okay? Catholics were newcomers, and they came in great numbers during the 19th century, and they caused a lot of concern for people. So that's what I'm really going to talk to you about today. So just a couple of, and I'll put some PowerPoint slides up on Moodle so you can get some of these figures for yourself. But I didn't want to just read them to you and split screen, but just a couple of immigration figures about Catholicism that you might not know of. But before the 19th century, there were only about 150,000 Catholics total in the United States. They were a tiny minority. They were mostly in Maryland, which was named for Mary, and in Louisiana. But Catholics were a very, very small religious minority. But 33.6 million Catholics immigrants arrived in the United States between 1820 and 1920. And the vast majority were from the following groups, and a lot of us have our backgrounds from these groups too. We have Irish, German, Italian, and Polish. My family's background is Polish. So between 1820 and 1920, Catholicism went from a tiny minority, almost sect, to be the most dominant, most populous denomination of Christianity in the US. The Irish came first. A lot of us have Irish backgrounds. I don't personally, but they began arriving in the 1820s. Between 1844 and 1854, 2 million Irish immigrants arrived here. And that was a quarter of the entire population of Ireland. So 25% of the people in Ireland left Ireland and came to the United States. This is why we have such strong Irish influence here in the US. The Germans also came in the between 1860 and 1900. About 3.5 million Germans arrived, and most of these were from southern Germany, Bavaria, which is a Catholic part of Germany. Wisconsin had the greatest number of German immigrants in the U.S., and so we still have a very, very strong German influence in Wisconsin today because of this. Italians were later. So if you have an Italian background, your ancestors came after 1870. There are almost no Italian immigrants at all here prior to 1870. Between 1880 and 1900, about 1 million arrived. And by 1920, 4 million had arrived. So in some ways, the Italian immigration was a spillover into the 20th century. And that's the same with the Polish as well. Polish immigration came between 1870 and 1920. 2 million Polish immigrants arrived in the United States in those years, and many of them ended up in Chicago, Milwaukee, and also our part of the country here. It's interesting to think about Wisconsin because in Wisconsin, between 1836 and 1850, the population of the state went from 11,000 to over 300,000, and a third of those people, of those 300,000 people, were not born here. So when you hear about nativism, when you hear about anti-immigrant sentiments here, this state is a state of immigrants, and there was a time when a third of the people who lived in Wisconsin were born in another country. Only out of these 300,000 people in Wisconsin, only 48,000 of them spoke English, and most of those were Irish. And of the non-English speaking immigrants, Germans were by far the most numerous. And Germans were famous for not learning English. They didn't want to learn English. They wanted German language societies, German schools. They started kindergarten, which is a German invention and a German word. And that was a place for German children to learn German ways and German language in public schools. So again, the idea that immigrants need to get here and learn English immediately was not something that happened in the 19th century. Especially not here in Wisconsin. So why is this important for us? Well, Catholicism seems now to be just one of many forms of Christianity. And many of us, depending on how our families, were set up, what we learned growing up, wouldn't really know the difference between Catholicism and Lutheranism. They seem kind of similar. Catholicism is a form of Christianity, like many others. But in the 19th century, Catholicism was despised in many quarters. There was a widespread fear that the United States, which was a relatively new country, just a few decades old, would be subjugated to papal authority, that our Constitution would be overthrown in favor of canon law and obedience to the Pope. Samuel Morse, who was the inventor of Morse code and a very prominent 19th century inventor and thinker, he believed very strongly that the Vatican was plotting to take over the United States and was planning to build a new Vatican in Cincinnati. And this conspiracy theory was very widely held. Catholics were major threat. Now, I want to talk about why that is. There's a lot of reasons for that. And one of them is the hatred of immigrants, right? And if we were in class together, and we can talk about this, we'll be talking about this on Thursday when we meet, why is there generally hatred of immigrants? Immigrants are seen as a threat for a number of reasons, having to do with economics, that they will take jobs, that immigrants are going to take benefits from real citizens that have been here longer, that immigrants are often, the rhetoric around immigrants has to do with poverty, disease, and habits that are seen as unclean or problematic or damaging. And so these are some of the reasons then and now why Catholics, immigrants, were despised. I'm going to show you something here on this screen in a minute. Okay, so here's an image. Oh, this is not the right one. This image. Okay, this is a 19th century cartoon, and it says contrasted faces. Look on this picture and then on that. Picture on the left is a ideal woman of the 19th century in America. And the picture on the right is named Bridget McBruiser. She's supposed to be an Irish immigrant. And if you look at these two images, you see some of the stereotypes and fear about immigrants here. This woman is stylish. She has a high forehead. She has beautifully coiffed hair. And she's looking demurely down. She's not looking straight out ahead. She's looking down. She has a long, straight nose. These are idealized features of an Anglo-American woman. Here on the right, Bridget McBruiser. What do we see here about her? We obviously see her hair is a mess, right? Her clothing is nothing but some kind of an old sheet or cloak or something. But look at her face, right? She looks less than human. She looks like an ape. And it might surprise you to know that Irish people were not considered white during much of the 18th or 19th century. There were arguments made that they were another race entirely, right? This is fear of immigrants, dehumanization of immigrants. She has a short nose. She just looks like a chimp. Her nose is red. That implies that she is an alcoholic. And her gaze, right? Oops. Her gaze is, I don't know why this keeps going. Her gaze is straight ahead, right? And this idealized woman on the left, her gaze is not straight ahead. That implies that she has appropriate modesty, that she knows what it means to be a woman of morals and of manners. And this woman is looking straight at us, right? And a lady doesn't do that, right? That's what a brazen woman of low morals with no manners would do. Okay, so these are images of an Irish immigrant, and we can see here some of that dehumanization taking place. An Irish Catholic immigrant. Okay. Somehow I'm gonna have to pause this again. Okay, so those are general fear of immigrants that we still see today. We can probably see some of those. We can definitely see some of those same fears and same arguments about immigrants today. But Catholicism was a threat to the United States, also particularly not just because Catholics were immigrants, but because of religious reasons. So for Protestants, right, we've read. We've learned about the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. Catholicism is wrong, according to many Protestants in the 19th century and today, because it does not place that sole authority in the Bible, right? Protestant reformers were very, very skeptical of the church and the tradition, right? Following in the steps of Luther, the Puritans, and all of those who came after. The Bible is the sole source of authority. Catholics have multiple overlapping and intersecting sources of authority, and so this was highly problematic. Within the American context, right, so leaving aside anti-immigration, leaving aside these theological disputes, the Catholic Church was understood, and indeed really was in many ways, especially in the 19th century, an anti-democratic, monarchical institution, right? Catholicism is not a democracy. We don't get to vote on who the priest is. We don't get to vote on who the Pope is. We don't get to vote on liturgical changes or rules or anything about it, right? It is a top-down hierarchical structure, and as we learned about the papacy, it's modeled, it's a monarchy. It's not a democracy. So the idea that Catholicism was compatible with a constitutional republic was really, in a way, it was a true concern, right? The Catholic Church of the 19th century was opposed to some of the founding ideas of the Constitution, like separation of church and state, like a free press. Catholicism was not about, each person gets to decide for themselves what's true about God or what's true about meaning. It was a corporate decision, a decision made by tradition, right? Another thing about Catholicism is that Catholicism is not about individualism, right? Especially not in the 19th century. Catholicism is about a group identity. Catholicism, right, if we think back to those ideals of obedience that we read back in the Rule of Benedict, Catholicism is about sort of something, a group identity that's larger than the self. And America, as we talked about, especially in the 19th century, but still today, is a highly individualistic culture, right? Each person has to determine meaning for his or her own self in the American context. And that is just simply not how Catholicism works, right? In Catholicism, you don't get to just do it yourself, right? You don't get to just open up the Bible and read it and be there in the presence of God necessarily, right? You need a priest, you need the sacraments, you need a mediator, you need a tradition. All of these things were seen as antithetical to the new ideals of the brand new United States of America. And so Catholicism raised lots of suspicions. What forms did this anti-Catholicism take? There were many. There was an entire political party in the 19th century called the Know-Nothings that flourished between 1851 and 1858. And this party advocated for severe limitations on immigration from Catholic countries. The Know-Nothings wanted a 21-year ban or a 21-year wait before an immigrant could get citizenship. Okay, so these are if you immigrated here at age 20, you would not be eligible to become a citizen until you were middle-aged in your 40s. The Know-Nothing Party required, or on their platform was a requirement that all public school teachers must be Protestant, that no political office of any kind would be open to immigrants. So if you came here from another country and ran for office, that would be illegal. And there were many, many, many books published, like the one we read that you'll be reading this week, Immigration, Its Evils and Consequences. Many newspapers, magazines, publications were entirely dedicated to wiping out Catholicism, to purging America of Catholics. And sometimes this anti-Catholic rhetoric became more than rhetoric. Sometimes it became violence. So, for example, some famous examples: in 1834, a Protestant mob burned down a convent in Massachusetts, demanding that the girls who were being held captive there, supposedly, it was a convent school for girls, that the girls who were being held captive there be released. And so they burned down the convent. In Philadelphia, New York, Boston, there were riots that resulted in death. And many of these took place over a particular issue, and that's the issue of the Bible in the public schools. And so I'm going to talk about Catholicism in public education for a few minutes now. Many of you in the class, I know, went to Catholic school, Catholic grade school, but many of you didn't, even if you were Catholic. And a couple of generations ago, it would have been extraordinarily rare for a Catholic to go to a public school. Catholics went to Catholic schools. And there's some really interesting reasons for this. And if you're an education major or interested in the history of education, you might have already learned some of this. But in the 19th century in the United States, the idea of public education was new, and it was actually quite radical. The idea that everyone deserved an education. Prior to the 19th century, the idea that education would be available to all was really unthinkable. If you were wealthy, you had access to private tutors, you would get an education. If you were poor, you went to work, and you would learn only what was needed for you to perform your duties, whether that was sewing or whether that was a trade of some kind. Wealthy people got an education, they got a private education. Poor people did not get an education. In the 19th century, educational reformers, who were considered very radical, came in and instituted a universal public education here in the United States. The idea that everyone, rich or poor, should have access to education took root here in the 19th century. And we call those public schools. But in reality, those 19th century public schools were Protestant schools. They were not public in the sense of being secular in any way. They were public in the sense of being Protestant, right? And they were Christian. So, for example, the 10 Commandments would have been taught in school. The Bible stories from the Bible, stories of Jesus, stories from the Hebrew scriptures, these would have been part of the curriculum. And so Catholics objected to this. They objected to the Bible being taught in public schools. Why? I'm going to ask you that when we meet. I want you to think about why it would be that Catholics would object to the Bible being taught in schools. By the 1840s, nearly half the residents of New York City were Catholics, foreign-born Catholics, or the children of foreign-born Catholics who were in these Protestant schools, these public schools. And there were enough of them, they had enough power, they had enough clout in New York City that they were able to form their own Catholic school system. Bishop John Hughes in New York City starts the first Catholic school system. He says, "We are unwilling to pay taxes for the purpose of destroying our religion in the minds of our children." This is what the Bishop of New York City said. "We are unwilling to pay taxes for the purpose of destroying our religion in the minds of our children." And so the power of all of those people, of all of those Catholics, they took their money, they took their the money of the church, their money that they were earning, and they started a massive Catholic school system that spread throughout the country. So I'm going to leave it at that. When we meet on Thursday, we're going to talk about the reading that you have, this anti-Catholic document about immigration. And I want you to be prepared to talk about what is going on in this document. I want you to have it with you. We're going to be referring to it. I want you to be able to say what you think is going on here and how this writer sees the conflict between being an American and being a Catholic. What is it about being Catholic that for him makes it impossible to be a good American? We'll also be talking about an incident in the public schools and that also was a catalyst for the making of the Catholic school system. Okay, thank you. We'll talk to you in a couple days.